over the concept of value versus values, I realized I know my message this morning will resonate with you because frankly, the whole issue of bringing women to the table in private equity is about creating economic value, but it's also about aligning the industry with the social values of my beneficiaries. So it's really nice to have this friendly audience, and it'll afford me the opportunity to be a little more direct. I'm usually quite direct. So to be honest, gender parity is not an issue I set out to promote when I first came to the State Investment Board in 2003. It's an issue that I really have felt compelled to act upon, more based on the dismal record of the industry, the overwhelming evidence, as Joe referred to, that in fact diversity does make a difference in return, and then my own personal experience, which I'll get to, my Davos story. And so one of the things I just wanted to note that, even though I didn't set out to champion this cause, sometimes in our professional lives, the really meaningful work finds us rather than the other way around. And let me try and advance, there we go. So let's start with the data. And I really call this the why should we care slide. So if you think about the world of finance itself, about 20% of the world of finance is made up of women. That's a pretty bad record. But if you look at private equity, it's even worse. And even by finance industry standards, it's pretty dismal. So if you look across here, about 10 to 12% of senior professionals are women in the PE industry. And that number has not changed over the years. And interestingly enough, it's geographically neutral. It doesn't matter. Even here in North America, where women's issues have been much more a part of the conversation for years, we don't have a better record in private equity than, say, Asia or the rest of the world or Europe. And so 10 to 12%, that's bad enough, but if you exclude human resources, investor relations, legal, and operations, professions that are more easily attained by women, there's less than 6% of women. So in other words, very few women are in deal-making roles. And so why should we care about that? Why is it important? Well, I think it's really important because private equity hires, the private equity partners are the ones who hire the CEOs and the boards of the companies, the portfolio companies that they own. So think about the role of private capital. It's to seed the next generation of companies and to turn around and remake existing companies, poorly performing companies. So if PE partners, the 6% that are women, if PE partners are the ones who are selecting the C-suites and the board members of the future large companies of the Fortune 500, and they're essentially perpetuating a lack of diversity in the broad economy. So it's like no wonder that we don't see any real change in the Fortune 500 C-suites. Because you have private capital plays a huge role in seeding those future leaders. And you think about Google or you think about Facebook, think about Sheryl Sandberg and the platform she's had. Well, she started out at Facebook when it was just a tiny startup. And now she's a significant executive. Think of Meg Whitman, who grew up really with eBay and now is a CEO of HP. So we absolutely have to get the attention of our private equity partners. We have to get more women who have networks with other women so that we actually can influence more broadly the broad economy. So that's actually sort of the value side of this issue. And let's now turn to what I'd call the value side of the equation. It's interesting that bottom line, most LPs, over 88%, do not see women as a de facto means to better performance. They do see value in team quality. They think team quality would be enhanced by adding women to the team. And they also think team dynamics would be enhanced. But bottom line, gender balance for LPs is viewed as something that may have a qualitative or a values benefit, but not of economic value. And therein, I think, lies the root of the inaction by LPs on this issue. So you heard, again, from Lisa's panel yesterday, that the only way to really move institutional investors into impact space or to care about sort of some of the issues that you are very passionate about is you've got to demonstrate a values-based impact, but you also have to you have to have a strategy that produces significant economic value. And I think the same principle really holds true here. For instance, in Washington State, performance of private equity, it's really our alpha generator. So private equity has consistently for us returned about 300 to 500 basis points over the public markets, and that's been consistent over decades. We've been in the asset class for about 30 years. We're not willing to give up even a couple basis points of that outperformance. It's a huge important component to us meeting the financial obligations that we have. But ultimately, over time, I really have moved from someone who, like my peers, observed the phenomena of the lack of women in the industry, but I did not feel compelled to do anything about it until I had a very personal experience at Davos, and I'm going to describe that for you. So, once upon a time in Switzerland, a lot of things start at the World Economic Forum in Davos. But because of the global footprint of our assets and because of our public funds mission, I've been invited to attend the annual meetings for the last 3 years. And I have to admit, it's a fairly heady atmosphere, and it's a real privilege to get to go to Davos. But the one thing that really struck me 3 years ago when I arrived is how few women were in the room. And particularly, they kind of divide your industries up, and you have separate industry meetings. So you have your plenary sessions like here, and then you have your industry meetings. And I was a part of the investor industries, and a lot of private capital, a lot of private equity partners are members. That's where a lot of our fees go, is to send them to Davos every year. And I found myself the only woman in the room in many, many of those meetings. And I kind of joked about it later. I said, I'm really used to being the only woman in the room. Anyone who works in business and finance, we've all experienced that. But it was at a whole other level at Davos. I sort of joked later, and I said, I felt like I walked into a British men's club. They kind of looked at me like I was a unicorn or something. It's like they literally didn't know what to do with me. And so I tend to be fairly vocal. And in one meeting, we were debating the challenges, and there's about 80, 90, many of them are partners in the room, the challenges of getting talent into the private equity industry. And I look around the room, and so I kind of made a comment. I kind of quipped. I basically said, well, my goodness, when you exclude 50% of the population from your talent pool, no wonder you have a talent problem. And so that ended up leading to a fairly good... Like I say, I love this audience. So, interestingly enough, after I made that comment, I had a number of the partners, particularly those who we invest with, because they care about what we care about, they came scurrying over to me and said, but Teresa, we really try. And I looked at this one very, very senior, well-established, if I name the name, you would all know him. I looked at him and I said, you know what? I said, you're an industry that hires the smartest people in the world, pays them the most amount of money to solve the most complex business problems. Just look at this as a business problem and solve it. Because it is solvable. And that actually really got me thinking about this issue and why we should care about it. But it also made me realize later I had a couple different, different general partners come up to me and say, Teresa, we really would love to help you with this. We'd like to engage in some dialogue on this because this feels to us as a bit of an intractable problem and we don't know how to solve it. So in addition, a few weeks later, I was at a dinner in New York, and it was a small private dinner. It had some of our partners at it. And the topic came up again, and I shared my Davos story and, kind of what had occurred there. And one of the partners came up to me later, and he said, Teresa, you really should speak out on this, because we in the industry, frankly, are a bit lost. We realize that we have an image problem here. We're struggling with how to solve it. You as a major LP, Washington's very well respected in the private equity industry. I'm a rare female running a large institutional investor. He said, you really should speak out on it. You have an interesting platform. And so going from this question of sort of asking why me, I really ultimately started asking the question, why not me? And I called up the World Economic Forum staff a few weeks later, and I said, listen, there seems to be momentum and interest. And so the forum was very supportive. They have a broad gender parity initiative within the forum. And we held 2 workshops. The first one 2 years ago primarily focused on general partners to really tease out what the issues were. And then one just this last fall, what is it that LPs expect from our general partners? And in this next fall, we're going to have another workshop basically focused on how to get more women into the portfolio companies that they own. So basically, I want to share now with kind of what those workshops, what the results of those workshops have been, and kind of how our thinking has changed on it. And I really think as we've gained momentum, and frankly, as we've created a safe space for people to talk about this issue and not be uncomfortable talking about it, we've come to look at it a bit differently. And I think what we're recognizing is gender issues for what it really is. And first and foremost, and this is in language that investment people can appreciate, a lack of diversification is really an impediment to good returns, because if you think about diversification is the only free lunch in investing, lack of diversity leads to lack of diversification. You need a diversity of views to get a truly diverse investment strategy. So that first and foremost is something that really resonated across the industry as well, with both GPs and LPs. The other thing is, if you put a constraint on talent, which when you only hire people who look like you, you really are going to have a suboptimal opportunity set in terms of human resource. So that's another really important thing. And then frankly, in the end, it's really, we've kind of changed the conversation from how many women do we need in our ranks to do we have the best gender mix to serve our client needs. And one of the examples that really came out, we all know that women are the primary consumers, particularly in our economy. And yet you have men running the consumer businesses and consumer divisions of our GPs. And so just to sit and think about how do you ultimately align with your consumer, your client, is an important thing to think about. So we're really changing the questions that we ask. And again, and we're going from what historically was more a values discussion to really how do we create value in the industry. This evolved discussion is beginning to yield results. And I'll talk about, I think, why. And I think we're relying on 3 what I would consider sort of interrelated and effective components. The first is cohorts. Groups like the World Economic Forum, like USCIF, like the CFA Institute, are all beginning to provide a constructive forum for dialogue on this issue, and we hear about it more and more. Credibility, again, the research, I don't need to repeat the research because it's been gone over here quite a bit in the diversity session yesterday afternoon, a lot of really good evidence of why it's important to have diverse ideas and diverse workforces. So the research is really overwhelming, it's consistent, and we all have access to it now. And then finally, connections. If you think about momentum and how it's built in any cause, a lot of it does start with personal conversations, not just policy initiatives. It starts with relationships and with networks. And so I think what we've really done as an industry is we're moving beyond judging to actual problem solving. And again, I think one of the observations I've made just in my own career is I was coming up in my own career, I really didn't want anyone to even notice I was a woman. You know, I just wanted to be noticed for my skill and how hard I worked and what I could produce. But now, based on all this body of research, we really are beginning to celebrate our differences and understand that we bring very different perspectives to the table based on gender and other diverse factors. And we're willing to openly talk about that. It used to not be politically correct to even acknowledge that we were different from one another. You know, women essentially had to, you know, hide that they were pregnant, and now everyone celebrates the bubble, you know, or the baby bump. So it's just a conversation that's a lot easier to have now than it was, say, a decade ago, and I think that has really helped. So where does this leave us? I think what I would say is we're really moving from realization to actualization. We used to debate about whether gender diversity is an issue. Now we debate what can be done to improve the issue. That's a huge step. As investors, we're competing for talent with other industries, not just investment firms, and so We're recognizing that. The tech sector is drawing a lot of, the most promising young female MBA students are going into the tech sector. I had GPs tell me when they go to the campuses like Harvard and Stanford, they are not able to even get women to sign up for meetings with them. And I said, you know, part of it is the PE industry has such a horrible image among young women, and tech is known for better work-life balance, faster promotion opportunities. And so the young talent is opting out of this industry, and that's dangerous for the industry long term. And then finally, women are an increasing financial market force. I heard at the discussion on diversity yesterday, Morgan Stanley talk about how increasingly wealth is controlled and owned by women in this country. They own more capital than ever, and private equity feeds into that. So how do we start addressing this? And I think, bottom line, people have really asked me, what are we doing in our own organization to address this issue? And at the WSIB, we're fortunate to have a really strong complement of women in our ranks. I think it doesn't hurt that, you know, as a female CEO, young women, when they come in and interview, go, wow, this would be really fun to come work here because I know I'd have a champion, and I have someone who looks like me who can help me along in my career. So we're doing that. But I think just when I think about in my own business, I think what every firm has to do is understand their own culture and adapt some of the lessons that we're learning to their own culture, take the small steps that they need to take. And basically, the whole issue of tone at the top, having leaders who are really willing to address the issue is really important. Just since we started this conversation with our partners, Blackstone made a very public announcement that they were going to extend maternity and paternity leave up to 4 months for paid leave. KKR has implemented a program where essentially the child care person, the nanny, can travel, is paid, their travel expenses are paid to travel with the senior partner when they're off on a deal, and that can be both either men or women in the firm. So some of these things that are more friendly in work-life balance are already being implemented, but everybody has to do it in their own firm in their own way. What we have to do is just provide a variety of solutions and models to assist them with it. I think most of what we've learned through this couple years of dialogue is that we have to be really pragmatic, and the solutions have to be accessible to people who make the organizational decisions. I'm not going to go through this whole list of things that the conclusions of the workshops. You could go to the World Economic Forum's website and pull off the papers, or you can contact me afterwards and we'll make sure you get the actual detailed best practices that came out of the workshops. But all of these ideas are really just jump starters for organizations who are wanting to deal with the issue. And I look forward to sharing any of those results with you that any of you are interested in. So kind of in summary, I'll leave you with 4 simple tenets of gender diversity. Number one, investors do understand and appreciate the concept of diversification, and so it's not a big stretch to go from diversification to diversity. It's actually Scott Evans, who runs the New York City retirement systems, who really is emphasizing that and putting that into practice in his own organization. Business growth and sustainability depends on talent, and why in the world would we constrain our sources for top talent? You know, and this goes beyond to just thinking about how to attract more women from, you know, the major MBA schools or from the investment banking. It's really looking even beyond that to a more diverse set of experiences of coming into PE. One of the things that came out of the workshops is the PE firms say they primarily hire from investment banks, and the reason they hire from investment banks is because the technical training that their young associates need in valuation, company valuation, is taught so well at the investment banks. But they really realize as you progress in a private equity career, the qualitative skills are much more important. Networking, you know, relationship building, analytical skills around industry, you know, industry trends, et cetera. And so the early technical skills very quickly are supplanted by skills that go far beyond that. So one of the things the industry was thinking is, well, maybe instead of just hiring from investment banking or just the MBA programs that are focused on those technical skills, they should look at consulting or kind of broaden the feeder pool and look at other industries that have had more success in promoting women. So I think just in general, thinking of ways to not constrain your talent pool and get more creative about seeking it. And then, again, this whole issue of women are a powerful demographic in any economy. Financial planners, real estate agents learned this a long time ago. So the investment services industry can learn it as well. And then, most of us do succeed. The way we get ahead in our careers is by solving complex business problems. So again, my challenge to the general partners is this is a complex business problem. There's a lot of structural impediments, but those who solve it are going to be the most successful firms in the future. So with that, thank you, and I would love to hear your comments and ideas and questions on this very important topic.
Hi, thanks very much, Natasha. Thanks for the presentation. I thought it was great. I'd like to hear your comments, however, when you look at what happened in VC with Ellen Pao and Reddit. I think she articulated very well the subtlety that actually occurs in discrimination and unconscious bias. And I felt your presentation was a little absent in unconscious bias and subtlety, so to speak, which I think is a huge barrier. And, part of the consequences that we're seeing is the pay gap, for instance. But any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the issue of unconscious bias has really come up in, of course, all the literature. And the research does demonstrate so clearly that there are structural process things you can do to help guard against unconscious bias. So one of the things that, in terms of best practices that got shared at this particular GP workshop, was doing things like having blind pools when the resumes come in, having the HR office remove anything that would indicate gender, like names or any kind of thing so that it becomes a gender-neutral resume. And that automatically increased the number of women who ended up in the pool of names that got put forward to the manager. So that's one thing. Of course, training can have something to do with it, but again, I heard it at the diversity workshop yesterday afternoon, a great comment, which is it's unconscious bias. It's unconscious, so no matter how well you train, you're still going to have a bias. So it really is, at least from my perspective, more about process and structure, and there's some interesting work being done on that.
Morning. My name's Tim Smith, and I work at Walden Asset Management. Thank you for a great presentation. I followed Joe Keefe as co-chair of the investor subcommittee of the 30% Coalition, a group of women's organizations and investors who are striving to put women on boards. And two comments that I'd love your thoughts on. When we're at meetings of the Principles for Responsible Investing, we hear more and more discussion about how asset owners should be requiring their managers to act in certain ways, join PRI or integrate ESG into the investment process. So I'm wondering, just like asset owners required their law firms years ago to be much more proactive in terms of equality, whether you think we should be encouraging that too as we talk to private equity firms. So that would be one point. And then secondly, last week, in fact, the UAW Retirement Trust brought together a group of investors to talk to search firms to require that they step up and have a set of standards about how they would act in bringing, well, this was mostly looking at board diversity, but same question, right? Who you bring to the table, which was one of your bullet points, who you bring to the table for selection. So I wondered if you could talk first of all about our power as asset managers in asking companies to act differently, and secondly, the question of how we could stimulate search firms to be part of the solution?
Sure. On the first one, it was interesting when we first pulled the GPs together. The thing that really struck me is they basically said, and this came from both men and women leaders in the firms, they basically said, please ask us about this issue. Because those who are naturally inclined to champion this issue are frankly supported when the LPs put pressure on. And they said they welcomed it. And that surprised me because it came from some very, what I would consider kind of traditional male GPs that were saying, please keep agitating on this issue because we need someone to kind of get us to move off the dime on this. So LPs do have a big role. When I met with LPs later, and again, these have been fairly private conversations, so they're safe conversations. It's interesting because, as you all know, LPs compete for allocation from the GPs. So there's all of this really odd, kind of dynamic or dance that occurs between an LP and a GP. So LPs are fighting for better fees, better transparency, better disclosure, many of the issues that you guys have talked about over the last couple days here. But at the same time, they don't want to overly agitate their GPs because they don't want to get cut back on their allocation during the next fundraising. So the very best GPs really can kind of pick and choose who their LPs are. So this really came up in this kind of private conversations I started having with LPs. And ultimately, the bulk of them finally said, though, and again, I was thinking of Senator Whitehouse's comment about there's safety in numbers. Ultimately, what we really concluded is if we all band together on this, then there is safety in numbers, and we're not going to have to worry about essentially being penalized for asking and creating a bit of discomfort on the part of GPs. And for the most part, the LPs, the leading LPs, are not concerned about that. But there were some who were, and I even had with a very, very, very large Asian sovereign wealth fund say, well, great, I'm glad to have you guys go agitate because then they're going to give me your allocation. Well, that's not widely shared by the LP community. But at least he was honest. Again, these are about having honest conversations so we know what the barriers are. The issue of what gets measured, gets managed, we've actually worked, Hamilton Lane is our private equity consultant, and I've worked pretty closely with them. Mario, who runs that firm, is extremely gender-friendly. He runs a very gender-friendly firm, and he's helped me on this initiative. And we've thought about creating essentially a due diligence checklist, working maybe with ILPA on rolling that out in terms of actually measuring the numbers and the change over time. We're not ready yet to commit to that. We're still in the exploratory phases of that. But as Hamilton Lane right now, they do ESG checklists for their clients with GPs. They're doing all kinds of things, so why not a diversity checklist as well? In terms of the search firms, of course, we're pretty far removed from that. As an investor who invests through a GP, we're a limited partner. I don't know that we can have a lot of influence on it, but I really like the idea, and it's certainly something that we should begin asking our GPs, is just how do they conduct their search processes, and are they asking for diverse pools consistently? So thank you.
Teresa, thank you. Erica Karp, the founder and CEO of Cornerstone Capital. And full disclosure, our business plan was written on a flight home from Davos, looking for business model transformation and innovation. Yeah. And so in your day job, places like Davos or the White House or the OECD or any place else have this enormous power to convene, but that gets frittered away if there's not execution. So when we look for innovative and transformational business models, what are some of the questions that you ask of the senior management of the equity opportunities when you're trying to sort out if it's marketing and high-level chatter or if it's execution around transformation? What questions specifically do you ask?
Sure. I mean, I think if you think about private equity, the kind of shtick on private equity is it's really just public markets levered up. And so we're always looking to find out, and this is something we get disclosed in our due diligence process, is how much of their return is from leverage, how much is EBITDA growth, how much of it is multiple expansion. EBITDA is a good measure of actual maybe transformations within the organization or the portfolio company. So we're always asking those kinds of questions. The one thing though that's so interesting to me, and again this is what compelled me to actually decide to speak out on this issue, is I think these firms, there's a huge herding instinct that occurs in this profession. And I spent 7 years with a technology firm before I came to the State Investment Board, and it was during kind of the go-go days of the early days of the internet. And so I spent a lot of time on Sand Hill Road as our company was seeking financing. And what really struck me is whatever was the cool deal that got announced by some leading, like a Kleiner Perkins or something, then every single venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road wanted to invest in that same deal and was looking for entrepreneurs who are doing that same deal. And if you came in with the wrong message and you weren't part of that, they didn't want to talk to you. And this was early. I mean, I discovered this, 15, 20 years ago in my career, and I thought, oh my goodness, these are supposed to be really creative people. So again, this whole concept of getting more diverse views at the table is going to lead to more innovative business models and a different way of looking at things. So I think those kinds of conversations are just beginning to happen between LPs and GPs. But traditionally, we've always looked at, okay, what are you doing to actually increase value in your companies that you own versus just levering them up?
Hi, Teresa. Thank you very much for shining light on this topic. I'm Jalak Jobin-Putra. I have a bit of laryngitis. I've been a VC since 1999. 3 years ago, I launched my own venture capital fund, part of the 4% of women, senior women in the venture capital world, which is abysmal in this day and age.
Yes. Congratulations.
And part of the reason I did that was because I saw an opportunity for alpha by being a minority, by being a woman, by having all this experience in this sector, being able to spot opportunities that my male colleagues were consistently missing. And it's really played out in that way. The question, though, is, there's so many women that come to me who are inspired about starting their own funds, because as much as you guys may be talking to GPs about taking on women, there's a bit of tokenism that's now happening in the GP space, and I know it because I'm friends with a lot of these guys, and it's still very much that mentality. So a lot of women still don't want to go work at some of these firms, and they would rather work at my fund or try to get the right experience to start their own fund. But then it becomes an access to capital issue. Pension funds like yourself are large funds that don't fund micro VCs or smaller funds, which is how a lot of these newer funds and emerging managers start out. So how do you expect to address that gap? Because I do think we need new entrants in this space, and we're talking about women as well as underrepresented minorities who can't find their path to partner in a lot of these traditional venture funds that you guys are backing.
Yeah, no, and it's a question I get a lot, and I spend a lot of time thinking about. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, the WSIB, we have a 23% allocation to private equity. That means we have to put $3 to $4 billion to work every year in private equity in order to maintain our allocation. And to do that in a quality way with about 9 or 10 staff, we have to have our sort of average bite size for a fund is about $250 million and up. So microfinance, small venture firms, first-time venture firms, we just don't have the capacity or the staff time. It takes just as much time to due diligence a small firm that's going to take $10 million from us as to due diligence a firm that's going to take $500 million. So we are not going to be a source of capital for a firm like yours. And that's a harsh reality, but that's just the way it is. I think endowments, one of my friends, Colette Chilton, who runs Williams College Endowment, loves private equity and she loves venture. And she's under $2 billion. And so a single venture investment can actually have huge impact on her returns. For us, and we don't, just in general, we don't invest much in venture because it just doesn't scale for us. But even if we were to commit to it, it would have a negligible impact or a no impact on our returns just because of our size. So I think some of it is going to smaller sources of capital where a small bite size can still have a huge impact on the portfolio, I think is one place to go. But to turn this a little bit to where my leverage and my power is, it is with the large GPs. And if you don't get the large GPs engaged in this issue will never scale. And I think, you know, you've got to get the KKRs and the Blackstones and the Carlyles and the Warburg Pincus's. You've got to get
Right,
them
those are
committed
all
to this.
private equity, later stage
Yeah,
funds. A
yeah.
venture, I'd say, and since you don't do much venture, I guess, you know,
Yeah.
that's not where your leverage point is. But what I'm just seeing is a lot of tokenism, a lot of we got to get a woman,
Yep.
you know, on board, whoever she is, just to say we have a woman. And I don't think that kind of helps the cause overall. And I think, you know, supporting more women who want to create funds with different cultures is a very important piece.
We should move on to the next question so that everyone gets a chance. Okay? So,
Okay.
Cool.
Okay,
But
thank
thank
you.
you for your perspective, and maybe find me afterwards, because I'm in touch with several VCs who are doing some work in your area, in the Silicon Valley. Yeah.
So, Tracy,
Lisa.
just very quickly switching gears a little bit, you heard Seth Magaziner's comments yesterday as a treasurer of Rhode Island about some of the challenges of moving into ESG strategies and public funds. And you're the new chair of CII, the Council of Institutional Investors. So I just love some quick thoughts you have about his comments and sort of what you've seen in the public pension fund arena and some of your own challenges around ESG issues and shareholder engagement.
Yeah, you know, for us, and we've been really cautious and careful about how we approach ESG. And in fact, Chris Phillips, who's here with me today, heads up institutional relations for us, came 20 years at Russell, dealt with this issue a lot there. And we're still trying to kind of sort through what our position is. I mean, the one thing is what we ultimately decided is it's got to be core to our investment beliefs, and so we actually have an investment belief now around climate risk that even though we don't fully understand it and we're not able to completely assess the impact, it is imperative that our partners disclose, both our partners and the companies invest in, disclose what they think the impact and what the risk will be. So we're looking at it again from much more from a risk perspective, and trying to over time, get better at incorporating risk measures into our investment decision process. I still think the biggest issue for us in terms of fully embracing ESG is the lack of measures. So you need disclosure and you need measurement, because if you think about a traditional analyst, they're used to poring over data, and they're always broadly including every bit of data source they can get because they want to make good decisions. But I think the lack of sort of consensus around what really is meaningful measures is one of the challenges. But I know you guys are all working on those things. So I look at it as evolutionary. I think the treasurer, a lot of his comments resonated fully with us. But I guess what I would ask your community to do is just be patient with us as we try and sort this out, because again, we absolutely focus on the economic value. That's where the argument comes from. It doesn't mean values are separate from that discussion. They can very much be embedded on it. But a pure values discussion does not resonate with us, bottom line.
I'm Michael Lent with Veris Wealth Partners. My question is, you talked about bringing together LPs. Are you bringing together LPs from different sectors, for example, university endowments, foundations, et cetera? So in other words, there's power as LPs in, if you will, cross-sector work. And I know there's a lot of foundations very interested and university endowments interested in this issue.
Yeah, we haven't as much. I mean, I've had a few of my colleagues that I've gotten to know personally are running endowments, but for the most part, my network is other large institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. But I'd welcome, the more the better, to bring into the conversation.
My name is Michelle Clayman. I'm founder and managing partner of New Amsterdam Partners, and I'm also chair of the advisory council of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. So I live in New York, and we have our version of the golden rule, which is he or she who has the gold rules. So
That's a good one.
I'd like to applaud you for your leadership, because when you speak, people pay attention. And I also totally agree with you, it's about process. And to give you an analog that the team at Stanford has found in technology is there's an assumption that you have to have graduated from certain schools like MIT or Caltech or Stanford. what they found is if you take that out of the application process, they find a much more diverse pool educationally. So a lot of it is about setting up fair rules ahead of time to make sure that you get a decent pool. But I have a request of you, because I see these talented kids who these days don't want to go into finance. You know, it's ABF, anything but finance, particularly among the young women who come out of private equity or whatever. Can you communicate to the GPs that maybe after the damage that our industry has done to ourselves, that we need to rehabilitate ourselves?
Yeah, and actually there's a pretty significant movement among GPs to do just that. There was quite a bit of talk yesterday about branding of your particular strategies and the importance of communication and branding. The PE industry recognizes it has a brand problem. One of the things that I shared in Davos with some of our leading partners is, you know, I basically said nothing pisses me off more than when their reputation issues make it into my boardroom. When my beneficiaries come in and complain about an action of a GP and I have to become an apologist for their industry. That should never happen. And so I think that's been, and it's not just gender, I mean, it's all kinds of things, you know, the sort of the whole barbarians at the gate image. And so the industry has a group called the Private Equity Something Council. They're headquartered here in DC. They've been working for a year and a half on a campaign, an image campaign around that. But one of the things that I'll probably be coming out starting this summer. But one of the things I keep cautioning them is, you know, image without action is meaningless and in fact will damage it more. What it's really going to come from is taking the right actions as an industry, and over time then their image will also change. But the other thing I wanted to comment, we did involve Stanford and Harvard business schools in these workshops, and really interesting results from the schools. One of the things that they went back and talked to their leading MBA students, the women, and you're absolutely right, they were not interested in this industry. So it's an issue that's finally, I think, gotten the attention of the GPs, because historically they had, you know, 1,000 applicants for every opening, and that's changing. Thank you so much.